"You lost, old-timer? This ain't no public park." The voice, sharp and laced with a barely concealed sneer, cut through the midday heat. Specialist Thorne, new to the instructor cadre and brimming with the misplaced confidence of youth, stood with hands on hips, his shadow long and thin across the dusty ground. He was addressing the figure standing motionless by the perimeter fence of Fort Huachuca's desolate training ranges. The old man, clad in a faded denim jacket, a sweat-stained baseball cap pulled low, and work boots caked with the red Arizona dust, didn't flinch. He simply watched the recruits crawling through the sand, their movements sluggish under the relentless sun. Most assumed he was a local, maybe a retired groundskeeper, or just another drifter who'd wandered too close to the restricted zone. Thorne, fresh from a tour that had barely scratched the surface of true grit, saw only an obstacle, a civilian who needed to be reminded of boundaries. "Sir, I asked you a question. This is a live training area. You need to move along." Still no response. The old man's gaze remained fixed on the recruits, his posture unyielding, a silent monolith against the shimmering heat haze. Thorne's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, warning growl. "I'm not gonna tell you again. This isn't a show. Get out." A flicker, barely perceptible, in the old man's eyes. Not anger, not fear. Something far older, far deeper. A silent assessment. Then his gaze drifted, just for a moment, to Thorne's crisp uniform, his shiny boots, his unblemished hands. And then back to the struggling recruits. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, a quiet challenge to Thorne's authority, a living monument to something the young specialist couldn't possibly comprehend. Silas Thorne had been coming to these ranges every Tuesday for the better part of a decade. He parked his ancient, rust-eaten Ford F-150 in the same patch of sun-baked gravel just beyond the barbed wire, always before dawn, before the first reveille echoed across the parched landscape. He'd pour himself a cup of lukewarm coffee from a dented thermos and walk with a slight, almost imperceptible limp to his chosen spot by the fence line, a gnarled mesquite tree offering the only shade for miles. He never crossed the boundary, never spoke, never offered advice, even when a recruit faltered or an instructor bellowed a misstep. His presence was a paradox. Utterly still, yet brimming with an intensity that, for those truly observant, felt like a physical force. The younger recruits, fresh from basic training, barely registered him. A few joked he was a ghost, haunting the place where his career had ended. The seasoned instructors, however, knew better. They didn't know who he was, not precisely, but they recognized the weight of his silence. They saw the way his eyes, ancient and knowing, tracked every movement, every flaw, every spark of potential. It wasn't judgment in his gaze, but something akin to a memory, a silent recitation of lessons learned the hardest way possible. No one dared tell him to leave. This dusty patch of land, these grueling drills, this unspoken code of honor, it all felt like it belonged to him, even if he stood on the outside looking in. His clothes were always nondescript. A worn flannel shirt, a faded cap, sleeves invariably rolled up to the elbow, revealing forearms corded with age and sun-weathered skin. Most assumed the faint, almost abstract pattern on his left wrist was just a birthmark or a faded scar. But Miller, Private First Class Miller, one of the youngest and most observant recruits in the current cycle, had started to notice the details. The way the old man's gaze sharpened when a recruit executed a perfect tactical roll, or how his shoulders subtly tensed when a live round went wide. It was the body language of a predator, refined over decades, now observing without intent. Then came the dust storm. A sudden violent gust ripped through the range, blinding men, kicking up red clouds that stung the eyes and choked the lungs. Recruits dove for cover, instructors bellowed commands, and for a fleeting second, as Silas instinctively braced against the wind, his rolled sleeve fluttered higher than usual, and Miller saw it. Not a birthmark, not a scar, an intricate, faded tattoo, a stylized arrowhead, sharp and ancient, intertwined with the delicate, almost fragile petals of a desert flower. It was abstract, unlike any military insignia Miller had ever seen, yet it pulsed with an undeniable significance. It wasn't decorative. It was a mark of belonging, a symbol burned into flesh, the kind you didn't choose, the kind you earned. And in that moment, something shifted in Miller's gut. The old man wasn't just a bystander. He was a sentinel. Later that evening, the compound quieted, the air still thick with the scent of dust and sweat. Miller, too wired to sleep, found himself in the common room, hunched over a flickering laptop. His body ached, his mind buzzed with questions. He typed, "Stylized arrowhead desert flower tattoo military." Nothing. He tried variations, searched obscure military forums, even delved into declassified archives on forgotten conflicts. Most leads were dead ends, redacted documents, or vague whispers of black operations. Then, buried deep in a digitized collection of obscure historical society journals from the American Southwest, he found it. A grainy photograph from the late 1960s, titled Operation Crimson Bloom. The image showed a group of men, faces grim and determined, in a landscape that looked eerily similar to the Arizona desert. But the caption mentioned a remote region of Central America. One man in the photo, gaunt and intense, had the faint outline of that same tattoo on his forearm. The name beneath the photo was partially obscured, but enough remained: S. Thorne. Miller's breath hitched. Operation Crimson Bloom. A ghost operation, whispered about in hushed tones by a few old-timers. A covert unit sent into the deepest, most dangerous jungles to train indigenous forces against a burgeoning communist threat. An operation so sensitive, its existence was officially denied for decades. No medals, no public records, just a handful of men who vanished into the shadows and, if they returned, brought back only silence and the weight of what they'd witnessed. Silas Thorne was listed as the field commander, a young captain then, responsible for missions that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and moral ambiguity. He closed the laptop slowly, the screen reflecting his own stunned face. It wasn't just a veteran. It was a legend, a ghost from a war the public barely knew existed. The next Tuesday, the air on the range felt different. A palpable tension, a quiet hum that settled over the compound. Miller felt it the moment he stepped onto the field. The instructors, usually a cacophony of shouts and commands, moved with a newfound, almost reverent stillness. Their eyes, though focused on the drills, seemed to subtly acknowledge the lone figure by the fence. Silas Thorne stood exactly as he always did, arms folded, cap shadowing his eyes, watching. But this time he wasn't invisible. It started subtly. Command Sergeant Major Ramirez, a man whose reputation for unyielding discipline preceded him, paused during a demonstration of combat first aid. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, met Silas's across the dusty expanse. For a long moment, no words, no gestures, just a profound, shared understanding. Ramirez, a veteran of Desert Storm and Afghanistan, had seen the tattoo on Thorne's arm years ago, had quietly researched it, and had carried the secret with the weight it deserved. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin, then resumed his instruction, his voice softer, more deliberate. Later, during the grueling endurance run, 2 other senior instructors, both combat-hardened, slowed their pace near the fence line. They didn't break stride, but their gazes lingered on Silas, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a shared recognition of the lineage he represented. By late afternoon, as the sun dipped low, painting the desert sky in hues of orange and purple, most recruits had dragged themselves back to their barracks. But Miller remained, leaning against a sandbag barrier, his chest heaving, watching the old man. Then it happened. CSM Ramirez, a man who never deviated from protocol, never broke posture, walked slowly, deliberately, toward the fence. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He simply stopped 10 feet from Silas Thorne and stood at attention. Full, perfect, textbook posture. Seconds later, another instructor joined him. Then a third, then more. One by one, they formed a silent line across the compound, facing the man who had never asked to be seen. No command was given. No gesture. It just happened, as if an ancient, Unspoken truth had been unveiled, and the only response was to stand in its presence. Miller watched from a distance, a lump forming in his throat. It wasn't awe. It was a profound, almost overwhelming understanding. In that moment, ranks, scores, and qualifications meant nothing. They stood because they knew, because his silence had weight, because the faded tattoo on his arm meant more than any medal or commendation they would ever earn. When Silas Thorne finally turned toward his truck, no one moved. As he opened the door, one voice broke the profound silence. Calm, grounded, unmistakable. It was CSM Ramirez. "Sir," he said, not with command, but with a deep, resonant respect that echoed across the quiet range. "Would you consider speaking to the recruits next week?" Just a few words. Silas paused, one foot already in the cab. He looked back, his eyes briefly meeting Ramirez's, then sweeping across the silent line of instructors. His voice, when it came, was a low rasp, like the whisper of dry leaves in the wind. Nothing to say, and then he left. No fanfare, no thanks, just the soft crunch of gravel under tires and a trail of dust that settled slowly behind him. But long after he disappeared, the instructors remained standing, not because they were told to, but because some men never need to explain who they are. You see it in how others rise when they appear. The compound returned to its grueling routine over the next few days. The drills resumed, the shouting picked back up, and the recruits went back to counting reps, miles, and bruises. But something beneath the surface had shifted. Those who had witnessed the silent salute that Tuesday didn't forget it. They didn't talk about it either. They just carried it quietly, a shared secret, a profound lesson. Miller felt it most. The old man's silence lingered with him in the locker room, in the obstacle lanes, in the way he now triple-checked his posture and watched the instructors more carefully than before. It wasn't just reverence. It was responsibility. That tattoo, that stare, the weight of history pressed into skin and silence. It had changed something in him. He couldn't shake the need to do something, not to celebrate the man, not to expose him, but to acknowledge him. He brought it up one night after lights out, speaking just above a whisper to two teammates who'd stood near the fence that day. "We should mark that spot," he said. "The mesquite tree. The fence line." They didn't laugh. They didn't ask why. One of them just replied, "How?" They kept it quiet. No announcement, no permission, just action. A few nights later, under cover of darkness, they returned to the observation post with a small, hand-polished brass plate. They bolted it carefully to the inside of the fence just above eye level. Nothing flashy. No rank, no name, no dates. Just a few engraved words. Asterisk, here, silence speaks. Asterisk, the following Tuesday, Silas Thorne came back. Right on time. Same truck, same boots, same thermos in hand. He walked past the trucks, past the field, and paused just briefly as his eyes met the new plaque. He didn't touch it. He didn't react. He simply looked, then turned back toward the course, leaned against the same post as always, and resumed watching. But this time, something was different. This time, every recruit who passed near the fence line straightened their back, because even if they didn't know who he was, they felt what he represented. And that was enough. It wasn't until weeks later that anyone learned his full name. He didn't offer it. He never wore it. But word has a way of drifting when the silence is respected. One of the older instructors, a former Ranger Regiment team leader, recognized the tattoo, not from books, not from history, but from a grainy photo sealed inside a file few ever read. The name attached to it was Silas Thorne, Captain, Special Operations Group, Operation Crimson Bloom. Confirmed for operations that never made it past whispered conversations. No public commendations, no medals on record, only a handful of men still alive who remembered what he did, and fewer still who dared to speak of it. Thorne kept coming every Tuesday, never missed, never asked for anything. And every time he stood at the fence, more and more recruits began to notice. They didn't talk. They didn't gawk. They just watched from the corners of their eyes, straightened their lines, tightened their stances. Not because someone told them to, but because presence teaches louder than orders. One morning he didn't come. No announcement, No explanation, just an empty spot along the fence line. They waited. One Tuesday, then two, then a month. The plaque stayed. So did the silence. Eventually, Miller, now in the final phase of his training, returned alone to the mesquite tree after hours. The compound was still. The air was thick with that unique tension between nightfall and memory. He stood where Thorne used to stand, arms folded, gaze fixed on the course. It wasn't the same, but it was something, a ritual of respect, a way to say thank you without saying anything. When he turned to leave, he noticed something. Taped gently to the back of the plaque, a folded envelope, weather-worn, his name on it, Miller. No rank, no title. Inside was a single challenge coin, old, heavy, scratched by time. One side carried the stylized arrowhead and desert flower. The other bore no words, just a single, hand-etched line. Asterisk, still watching. Asterisk, he never found out who left it. No one claimed to know. But he didn't need confirmation, because some men never disappear. They just fade quietly into the lives they've shaped, leaving behind nothing but discipline, silence, and the kind of example that speaks long after they're gone. Some warriors leave behind medals. Some leave behind books. But the rarest ones, the ones we almost miss, leave behind nothing but presence. They don't speak often. They don't correct the record. They just watch silently to see if we've learned anything at all. Silas Thorne never asked to be remembered. He never told his story. But the silence he left behind taught an entire generation how to listen.